There is a particular kind of silence that follows a shipwreck. Not the silence of an empty sea, but something heavier. The silence of a world that has just changed and doesn't yet know it. History is full of these moments, these fractures hidden beneath the waterline, where a single vessel slipping under the waves altered the course of nations, erased entire communities, or buried secrets so deep that centuries would pass before anyone thought to look for them. We remember the Titanic, we remember the Lusitania, but the wrecks that truly reshaped the world are the ones most people have never heard of. Ships that carried not just passengers and cargo, but the fragile architecture of dynasties, the last hopes of refugees, and the invisible threads that held neighborhoods and nations together. Tonight, we are going to find them, resting quietly on the ocean floor, and we are going to tell their stories. We begin on a November evening in the year 1120 on the coast of Normandy, where a ship called the White Ship was preparing to cross the English Channel. This was no ordinary vessel. It was the finest ship in the Norman fleet, and its passenger list read like a registry of the Anglo-Norman aristocracy. At its centre was William Adelin, the 17-year-old son and only legitimate male heir of King Henry I of England. William had just attended a diplomatic summit between his father and the King of France, and the mood aboard the White Ship that night was celebratory. Wine flowed freely among the young nobles. The crew, reportedly, had been drinking as well. King Henry had already departed on a separate vessel, and the prince and his entourage lingered at the port of Barfleur in no particular hurry. When the White Ship finally pushed off from shore, it was late, well after dark, and the crew, eager to overtake the king's ship, drove hard into the channel. What happened next unfolded with a terrible swiftness. The ship struck a submerged rock just outside the harbour, a rock well known to local sailors, and the hull was torn open on the port side. Water poured in faster than anyone could respond. In the confusion and darkness, passengers scrambled over one another. William Adelin was actually placed into a small boat and was being rowed to safety when he heard the screams of his half-sister, the Countess of Perche, still trapped on the sinking vessel. He ordered the boat turned around. It was the last decision he ever made. The small craft was immediately swamped by desperate swimmers trying to climb aboard, and it capsized. William drowned, along with as many as 300 others. Only one man survived the wreck, a butcher from Rouen who clung to the mast through the freezing night and was pulled from the water at dawn. The consequences were staggering, and they reached far beyond personal grief. Henry I had spent his entire reign carefully consolidating power, and William Adelin was the linchpin of his succession plan. With William dead, Henry had no legitimate male heir. He spent the remaining 15 years of his life trying to solve this problem, eventually forcing his barons to swear allegiance to his daughter Matilda, an almost unprecedented act in a world that regarded female rule with deep suspicion. When Henry died in 1135, the barons promptly broke their oaths. Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois, seized the throne, and Matilda launched a war to take it back. What followed was nearly 2 decades of civil war known as the Anarchy, a period so chaotic and violent that a contemporary chronicler wrote that people said openly that Christ and his saints slept. England was ravaged. Castles were built by feuding lords across the countryside, local warlords terrorized peasants, and the machinery of royal governance ground to a halt. The anarchy only ended when Stephen agreed that Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, would succeed him. That young man became Henry II, the first Plantagenet king, and the dynasty he founded would rule England for over 300 years, producing Richard the Lionheart, Edward I, and the troubled line that eventually tore itself apart in the Wars of the Roses. All of it, every Plantagenet king, every crusade they launched, every parliament they convened or dissolved, can be traced back to a drunken crew, a submerged rock, and a prince who turned his boat around in the dark. The White Ship is the most consequential shipwreck most people have never heard of. A single November night that fractured the English succession and sent the entire medieval world lurching down a different path. And it all happened because a young man could not bear to leave his sister behind. A century passed, and then another, and then several more, and the age of European exploration brought with it a new kind of shipwreck, one that did not merely end a voyage, but created its own strange, violent world on whatever shore the survivors washed up on. No wreck illustrates this more disturbingly than the Batavia, a flagship of the Dutch East India Company that left Amsterdam in October of 1628, bound for the spice markets of Java. The Batavia was an impressive vessel, newly built, carrying a valuable cargo of silver coins, trade goods, and around 340 passengers and crew. Among them was the ship's upper merchant, a man named Francisco Pelsayat, and his subordinate, a junior merchant named Geronimus Cornelis. Pelsayat was in command of the commercial operations. The ship's skipper, Ariane Jacobs, handled the sailing. The two men despised each other, and Cornelis, an educated former apothecary with a taste for radical philosophy, saw opportunity in their rivalry. Before the Batavia even reached the southern hemisphere, Cornelis and Jacobs had begun plotting a mutiny. The plan was to seize the ship, take the silver, and begin new lives as pirates or fugitives somewhere beyond the reach of the Dutch East India Company. But the ocean intervened before the mutineers could act. On the 4th of June, 1629, in the pre-dawn darkness, the Batavia struck a reef in the Houtman-Abrolhos, a chain of small coral islands off the western coast of Australia. The ship broke apart over the following days, and the survivors, men, women, children and soldiers, were ferried to the nearby islands with whatever supplies could be salvaged. There was very little fresh water. The islands were flat, wind-scoured and desolate. Pelsayat, along with Jacobs and a small group, took the ship's longboat and set off on a desperate voyage to reach the Dutch settlement at Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, more than 1,000 miles to the north. He promised to return with a rescue ship. What he left behind was a powder keg. With Pelsayat gone, Geronimus Cornelis seized control of the survivors. What followed over the next 3 months was one of the most horrifying episodes in maritime history. Cornelis declared himself Captain General of the islands and organized a small group of loyalists into a private militia. He then began a systematic campaign of murder. His reasoning, to the extent that it could be called reasoning, was brutally pragmatic. Fewer survivors meant more supplies for those he wished to keep alive, and a population kept in terror was a population that would not resist. Men were killed on fabricated charges of theft or conspiracy. Women were assaulted and claimed as property by Cornelis's inner circle. Children were not spared. Over the weeks that followed, Cornelis and his followers murdered at least 115 people, possibly more, by drowning, stabbing, and bludgeoning. The killings were carried out openly, and Cornelis maintained a perverse bureaucratic order throughout, holding councils and issuing written decrees while the bodies accumulated. Not everyone submitted. A group of soldiers under a man named Weeby Hayes had been sent to a neighbouring island, ostensibly to search for water, but in reality because Cornelis wanted them out of the way. When the soldiers learned what was happening, they fortified their island, built crude weapons from salvaged materials, and prepared to fight. Cornelis attacked them several times but was repelled. The standoff was still ongoing when Pelsert finally returned aboard the rescue ship Saddam in September of 1629. Pelsert was met by Hayes's soldiers who warned him of what had happened. Cornelis and his followers were captured, tried on the islands, and subjected to brutal punishment. Cornelis and 6 of his chief accomplices had both hands amputated before being hanged. 2 others, judged too young for execution, were marooned on the Australian mainland, becoming, in a grim footnote, the first Europeans known to have lived on Australian soil. The Batavia wreck changed the way the Dutch East India Company managed its fleets. Security protocols were tightened, command structures were clarified, and the company became far more cautious about who was placed in positions of authority aboard its ships. But the wreck's deeper legacy is psychological. The Batavia has become a case study in how quickly social order can collapse when authority is removed. A real-world Lord of the Flies that played out on a cluster of coral islands 4 centuries before William Golding put pen to paper. The wreck site itself was rediscovered in the 1960s, and many of the Batavia's timbers and artifacts are now displayed in the Western Australian Maritime Museum in Fremantle. The skeletons of the murdered, buried in shallow graves on the islands, have been excavated by archaeologists, and their injuries confirm the accounts of the survivors. Fractures, blade wounds, and the marks of lives ended with terrible violence, far from home, on a shore no one had ever intended to reach. If the Batavia represents the darkest possibilities of a shipwreck, the loss of the Tech Sing represents something quieter and in some ways more melancholy. The disappearance of an entire floating community, swallowed by the sea with so little notice that the outside world barely registered it had happened. The Tech Sing was a Chinese ocean-going junk, and not a modest one. At roughly 50 meters in length, she was one of the largest vessels of her kind, a 3-masted trader built to carry both cargo and passengers on the busy maritime routes between southern China and the ports of Southeast Asia. In January of 1822, the Tech Sing departed the port of Amoy, present-day Xiamen, bound for Batavia, the same Dutch colonial capital that Francisco Pelsert had once sailed toward in his desperate longboat. Aboard were approximately 1,600 passengers, many of them Chinese emigrants seeking work and new lives in the trading communities of the Dutch East Indies, and a cargo hold packed with an extraordinary quantity of Chinese porcelain, along with fine silks and other trade goods. The ship's route took it south through the South China Sea and into the waters around the Bangka Strait, a passage between the islands of Bangka and Belitung off the southeastern coast of Sumatra. These waters were notoriously difficult, shallow, studded with reefs and sandbars, and poorly charted by the standards of the day. On the 9th of February, the Tech Sing struck a submerged reef in the Gaspar Strait. The hull was breached and the massive junk began to sink. With 1,600 souls aboard and nowhere near enough lifeboats, the scene quickly became catastrophic. Passengers who could not swim clung to debris. Families were separated in the darkness. The ship went down in relatively shallow water, but the sheer number of people in the sea made rescue almost impossible. By some estimates, around 1,500 people perished that night, making the Texing disaster one of the deadliest shipwrecks in history, a death toll that would not be surpassed until the 20th century. A small number of survivors were rescued the following day by a passing vessel, but the Texing itself was quickly forgotten. No great maritime inquiry was held, no memorials were erected, and the wreck slipped out of public memory almost entirely. The Chinese emigrants aboard had been, for the most part, poor labourers and their families, people with little political influence and no powerful advocates to demand answers. The sea had taken them, and the world moved on. It was not until 1999, nearly 180 years later, that the Texing was rediscovered by an English salvage diver named Michael Hatcher. What Hatcher found on the ocean floor was astonishing. The wreck was a vast porcelain graveyard containing an estimated 350,000 pieces of Chinese ceramics, bowls, cups, plates and vases, still largely intact beneath the sediment. It was the largest single recovery of Chinese export porcelain ever made, a cargo so immense that when it was auctioned in Germany in 2000, the sale took several days and drew collectors from around the world. The Texing's porcelain cargo has given historians an unusually detailed window into early 19th century Chinese trade networks. The ceramics themselves tell a story of industrial scale production in the kilns of Fujian and Guangdong provinces, where potters produced vast quantities of blue and white ware specifically for export to Southeast Asian markets. The styles, glazes and patterns found aboard the Texing have helped scholars reconstruct the commercial relationships between Chinese merchants and their customers in Java, Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. But the human story of the Texing remains largely untold. The passengers who drowned in the Gaspar Strait left few records behind. They were part of a vast and largely anonymous wave of Chinese emigration that reshaped the demographics of Southeast Asia in the 19th century, founding the communities that became the Chinatowns of Singapore, Jakarta, Manila, and Bangkok. The Texing was one ship among many that carried this migration, but it was one of the few that never arrived, and the silence that followed its sinking speaks to how easily the lives of ordinary people could vanish from the historical record when there was no one powerful enough to insist that they be remembered. There is a cruel arithmetic to historical memory. Some disasters are remembered not because they were the worst, but because they happened at the right moment, to the right people, in the right place. Others, equally devastating, are buried beneath the weight of competing headlines and simply never resurface. No shipwreck in American history illustrates this more painfully than the destruction of the steamboat Sultana on the Mississippi River in the early morning hours of April 27, 1865. When the Sultana's boilers exploded just north of Memphis, Tennessee, approximately 1,800 people were killed, more than perished on the Titanic, and more than in any other maritime disaster in American history. Yet if you stopped 100 people on the street today and asked them what happened aboard the Sultana, almost none of them would know. The reason is simple and bitter. The Sultana exploded at the single worst moment in American history for anyone hoping to make the news. Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated on April 14th, just 13 days earlier. The nation was still reeling. John Wilkes Booth had been hunted down and killed just the day before the Sultana disaster on April 26th. The newspapers were consumed with the aftermath of the assassination, the fate of Booth's co-conspirators, and the enormous question of what would become of the reunited nation. The Civil War had ended only weeks earlier, and every column inch of every newspaper in the country was devoted to the tremors of that upheaval. Into this overcrowded moment, the Sultana disaster landed with almost no impact. Some papers covered it, most buried it, and within weeks, the worst maritime disaster in American history had been more or less forgotten. The Sultana was a sidewheel steamboat, a common sight on the Mississippi in the 1860s, and she had been engaged in one of the war's final acts of mercy, transporting recently released Union prisoners of war from Vicksburg, Mississippi, back to their homes in the North. These men had survived the Confederate prison camps at Cahaba and Andersonville, places of legendary suffering where disease, starvation, and exposure had killed thousands. The survivors were gaunt, sick, and desperate to get home. The Sultana's legal capacity was around 376 passengers, including crew. When she left Vicksburg on April 24th, she was carrying approximately 2,400 people, more than 6 times her rated capacity. The reason for this grotesque overloading was a combination of greed and bureaucratic corruption. The federal government was paying steamboat operators $5 per enlisted man and $10 per officer to transport the freed prisoners north, and the officers responsible for allocating the prisoners among the available boats had been bribed to funnel as many as possible onto the Sultana. Her captain, J. Cass Mason, knew the boat was dangerously overloaded. He also knew that one of his boilers had been hastily patched just before departure, a repair that the engineers themselves considered inadequate. But the money was too good, and the pressure from the military officers was too strong, and so the Sultana churned north with her decks so packed that men were sleeping on every horizontal surface, stacked in layers, barely able to move. At approximately 2 a.m. on April 27th, 7 miles north of Memphis, 3 of the Sultana's 4 boilers exploded simultaneously. The blast tore the ship apart. The superstructure collapsed, the wooden decks caught fire almost immediately, and hundreds of men were thrown into the dark, frigid water of the Mississippi, which was running high and fast with the spring flood. Many of the passengers could not swim. Many were too weak from their months in prison camps to fight the current. The river was more than 3 miles wide at that point, swollen well beyond its banks, and in the darkness, survivors clung to wreckage, to tree branches, to each other. Some were carried miles downstream before being pulled from the water. Others simply disappeared. The fires burned for hours, and the screams carried across the flooded landscape to farms and settlements on the distant shore, where people launched boats and rafts to help, but could reach only a fraction of those in need. The final death toll was never precisely established. Official estimates placed it at around 1,200, but later research by historians has pushed the figure closer to 1,800, with some estimates reaching even higher. The victims were overwhelmingly Union soldiers who had survived the worst the Confederacy could inflict upon them, only to die on the river that was supposed to carry them home. A congressional investigation followed, and a military commission found that Captain Frederick Speed, the officer responsible for loading the prisoners, had been negligent. But Speed was eventually acquitted on a technicality, and no one was ever meaningfully punished for the disaster. The boiler manufacturer was never held to account. The officers who had accepted bribes were never prosecuted. the Sultana sank into the mud of the Mississippi and the mud of history, and for more than a century it remained a footnote, crowded out by the assassination of a president and the end of a war. It is a reminder that tragedy does not always announce itself on the front page, and that the dead do not always get the remembrance they deserve. On the morning of June 15, 1904, a steamboat called the General Slocum cast off from a pier on the East River in Lower Manhattan, carrying approximately 1,300 passengers on a Sunday excursion up the river to a picnic ground on Long Island Sound. Nearly all of them were members of St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church, a German-speaking congregation based in the neighborhood of Kleindeutschland, Little Germany, on the Lower East Side. The passengers were almost entirely women and children. The men of the congregation were at work, as was common for weekday excursions that fell on Wednesdays, which this one did despite how the calendar played out. The mood was festive. This was an annual outing, one of the great social events of the church's year, and the boat was full of families, mothers with their children, grandmothers, Sunday school classes, friends who had known each other for decades in the tight-knit German community. The General Slocum was a wooden-hulled paddle steamer, 23 years old, and she had passed her most recent safety inspection. What the inspection had failed to catch, or what the inspectors had chosen to overlook, would become a matter of public fury within hours. As the General Slocum steamed north through the East River, passing the industrial waterfront of the Bronx, a fire broke out in a storage compartment near the bow. The exact cause was never definitively established, though it was likely a discarded match or cigarette that ignited a barrel of hay and oily rags stored in a forward cabin. The crew attempted to fight the fire, but when they pulled the fire hoses from their racks, the hoses crumbled in their hands. The rubber had rotted through from age and neglect. The lifeboats had been painted over so many times that they could not be freed from their davits. The life preservers, which had been filled with cheap cork and granulated cork dust, had disintegrated internally. When passengers strapped them on and jumped into the water, the preservers fell apart, or worse, dragged them under. The captain, William Henry Van Schaick, made the catastrophic decision to continue steaming forward rather than beaching the ship on the nearest shoreline, arguing later that he feared setting fire to the waterfront oil tanks and lumber yards that lined the riverbank. The headwind generated by the ship's forward motion fanned the flames directly back over the passengers crowded on the decks. Within minutes, the General Slocum was a floating inferno. Passengers were trapped between the advancing fire and the churning water of the East River, which at that point ran with powerful tidal currents. Most of the women and children aboard could not swim. This was 1904, and swimming was not commonly taught to women or girls, particularly in immigrant communities where modesty and practical concerns kept them out of the water. The heavy, layered clothing of the era, long skirts, petticoats, corsets, and leather shoes, became death traps in the water, dragging women and children beneath the surface within seconds. Bystanders on shore and on nearby boats watched in horror and launched rescue efforts, but the fire moved faster than help could arrive. The General Slocum eventually ran aground on North Brother Island, but by then the ship was fully engulfed. Bodies washed ashore for days afterward, along the banks of the East River and the shores of Long Island Sound. The final death toll was 1,021, making it the deadliest disaster in New York City's history until September 11th, 2001. But the true devastation was measured not just in lives lost, but in the destruction of an entire community. Kleindeutschland had been one of the most vibrant immigrant neighborhoods in Manhattan, a dense, lively enclave where German was spoken on the streets, German newspapers were published, German beer halls and bakeries and churches anchored every block. The General Slocum disaster gutted it. There was almost no family in the neighborhood untouched by the tragedy. Women who had lost their children could not bear to remain. Families who had lost mothers, sisters, and daughters moved away. Many to the Yorkville neighborhood on the Upper East Side, others out of the city entirely. Within a few years, Kleindeutschland effectively ceased to exist as a German neighborhood. The buildings remained, but the people were gone, dispersed by grief into other parts of the city. The vacuum they left behind was filled by the next wave of immigration, and the Lower East Side became the Jewish, Italian, and Eastern European quarter that later generations would come to know. The physical and cultural geography of New York City was reshaped by a rotted fire hose, a painted-over lifeboat, and a captain who would not turn his wheel. The General Slocum disaster led to sweeping reforms in maritime safety law. Congress passed new regulations mandating regular inspection of safety equipment, fireproof construction standards, and proper crew training. Captain Van Schaik was convicted of criminal negligence and sentenced to 10 years in prison, though he was pardoned after serving 3.5. The steamboat inspection service was overhauled, but for the people of Kleindeutschland, the reforms came far too late. Their neighborhood, their world, had already sunk. On May 28, 1914, the ocean liner Empress of Ireland departed Quebec City, bound for Liverpool, carrying 1,477 passengers and crew down the broad, dark waters of the St. Lawrence River. She was not a glamorous ship. She did not have the fame of the Olympic-class liners or the speed records of the Cunard Greyhounds. She was a working vessel of the Canadian Pacific Railway's steamship line, a solid and reliable carrier that had made the Atlantic crossing 96 times without serious incident. Her passenger list that night included a large contingent of Salvation Army delegates travelling to a conference in London, a number of families emigrating to new lives in England, and the usual mix of businessmen, tourists, and crew that populated every transatlantic crossing of the era. By morning, 1,012 of them would be dead, and within a few months, almost no one outside of Canada would remember their names. The disaster happened in the early hours of May 29th, in the river itself, not the open ocean. The Empress of Ireland had anchored briefly to take on a river pilot and then continued downstream through light fog. Around 2 a.m, the crew spotted the lights of an approaching vessel, the Norwegian coal freighter Storstad, steaming upriver. What should have been a routine passing turned fatal when a bank of fog rolled across the river, obscuring each ship from the other. In the confusion that followed, the two vessels miscommunicated their intentions. The Storstad struck the Empress of Ireland on her starboard side, below the waterline, opening a wound that ran 14 feet along the hull. The Empress began to list almost immediately. Water poured through the open portholes on the lower decks, portholes that passengers had left open for ventilation on the warm spring night. The ship rolled onto her side within minutes, trapping hundreds of passengers in their cabins. Many never made it out of their berths. Those who reached the deck found that the severe list made it impossible to launch the lifeboats on one side of the ship, and the boats on the other side swung too far out over the water to be boarded. 14 minutes after the collision, the Empress of Ireland was gone. The speed of the sinking was what made it so lethal. The Titanic had taken 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink, giving many passengers time to reach the deck and board lifeboats. The Empress went down in 14 minutes, barely enough time for passengers on the upper decks to orient themselves, let alone for those trapped below to find their way through flooding, pitch-dark corridors to the exits. The water temperature in the St. Lawrence that night was around the freezing mark, and those who did make it into the river had only minutes before hypothermia set in. The Salvation Army contingent was particularly hard hit. 130 of the 170 delegates aboard were killed, a loss so severe that the organization's leadership described it as the worst single blow in their history. Entire families were wiped out. Of the 138 children aboard the Empress, only 4 survived. The Empress of Ireland has been called the Titanic of Canada, and the comparison is both apt and revealing. Apt because the scale of the loss was genuinely comparable, and revealing because it highlights exactly why the Empress has been forgotten. The Titanic sank in 1912, just 2 years earlier, and its story had already become the defining maritime disaster of the age, a narrative so powerful and so heavily mythologized that it left little room in the public imagination for another catastrophe at sea. Then, just 10 weeks after the Empress went down, the guns of August opened the First World War, and the attention of the entire world pivoted to a catastrophe of such overwhelming scale that a single shipwreck, no matter how terrible, could not compete. The Empress of Ireland slipped into the gap between 2 of the 20th century's most consuming events and was quietly forgotten by everyone except the families of the dead and the historians who study them. Her wreck lies in the cold, murky water of the St. Lawrence, in just 40 metres of water, designated as a National Historic Site by the Canadian government. Divers visit it regularly. The current is strong, the visibility is poor, and the ship lies on her starboard side, the side that took the blow, settling slowly into the riverbed's silt. She is remarkably intact, considering how quickly she went down, and the artifacts recovered from her, shoes, spectacles, pocket watches stopped at the moment of sinking, carry the same quiet, unbearable weight as the relics of any disaster that stole ordinary people from ordinary lives. By the winter of 1917, the Canadian port city of Halifax, Nova Scotia, had become one of the most important harbours in the Allied war effort. Convoys assembled there before crossing the Atlantic, warships refuelled and resupplied in its deep natural harbour, and the city's wharves and rail yards hummed with the constant movement of material bound for the Western Front. Halifax was a military city, a logistics hub, and a bottleneck. And like all bottlenecks, it was a place where too many things were being pushed through too small a space with too little margin for error. On the morning of December 6th, 1917, that margin finally disappeared. The SS Mont Blanc was a French cargo ship, unremarkable in appearance, that had arrived from New York carrying a cargo so dangerous that the port authorities in New York had refused to let her dock at the main piers. Her holds were packed with approximately 2,700 tons of explosive and incendiary materials, wet and dry picric acid, TNT, benzyl fuel in drums stored on deck, and gun cotton. She was, in effect, a floating bomb, the single most concentrated collection of high explosives ever loaded onto a ship at that time. On the morning of the 6th, the Mont Blanc, was making her way into Halifax Harbour through a channel called the Narrows, a passage barely wide enough for two large ships to pass. Coming in the opposite direction was the SS Emo, a Norwegian vessel chartered for Belgian war relief, outbound and moving faster than she should have been in the confined waterway. What followed was a slow-motion catastrophe visible to thousands of people on both shores of the harbour. The two ships exchanged whistle signals, but each misunderstood the other's intentions. They manoeuvred to avoid collision and, in a terrible irony, manoeuvred directly into each other's paths. The Emo struck the Mont Blanc on the starboard bow at low speed, a glancing blow, not a devastating one. But the collision ruptured the barrels of benzol stored on the Mont Blanc's deck. The volatile fuel spilled down into the hold and ignited. A fire broke out that the Mont Blanc's small crew knew they could not fight. They understood exactly what was in the hold below them, and they abandoned ship immediately, rowing for the Dartmouth shore and shouting warnings that, in the noise and confusion of a working harbour, went largely unheard. The burning Mont Blanc drifted across the Narrows and came to rest against a pier on the Halifax side. Crowds gathered on the waterfront to watch the fire. School children pressed their faces to classroom windows. Firefighters raced toward the pier. At 9:04 in the morning, the Mont Blanc's cargo detonated. The explosion was the largest man-made blast in history up to that point, a record it would hold until the atomic bomb was tested at Alamogordo 28 years later. The force of the explosion was estimated at roughly 2.9 kilotons of TNT. The Mont Blanc was annihilated, literally vaporized. A fireball rose more than a mile into the sky. A pressure wave radiated outward at supersonic speed, flattening every structure within an 800-meter radius and severely damaging buildings for miles beyond that. The water of the harbour was displaced by the blast, exposing the seafloor momentarily before rushing back in a tsunami that swept over the waterfront on both sides of the Narrows. A white-hot rain of metal fragments, the shattered remains of the Mont Blanc's hull and cargo, fell across the city. One fragment of the ship's anchor shank, weighing over half a ton, was found 3.5 kilometres from the blast site. The devastation in the Richmond district of Halifax, the neighbourhood closest to the explosion, was total. Entire blocks were reduced to splinters. Factories, churches, homes and schools were obliterated. The fires that broke out in the wreckage burned for days. Approximately 2,000 people were killed outright or died shortly afterward from their injuries. 9,000 more were injured, and among the most common injuries were catastrophic eye wounds caused by flying glass from the windows that thousands of people had been looking through when the blast wave arrived. More than 6,000 people were left homeless in the middle of a Canadian winter, with temperatures well below freezing and a blizzard arriving the following day. The city's north end had effectively ceased to exist. The Halifax explosion transformed not only the city, but the practice of emergency management itself. The relief effort that followed was one of the largest humanitarian responses of its era, drawing aid from across Canada, the United States, and the Allied nations. The Massachusetts state government, which responded with particular speed and generosity, sending a relief train loaded with supplies, doctors, and nurses within hours of receiving news, was thanked with a gesture that continues to this day. Every December, Nova Scotia sends a large Christmas tree to the city of Boston, a tradition that has endured for more than a century. The explosion also led to significant changes in the international regulations governing the transport and handling of explosive materials by sea, and it provided data, grim, involuntary data, that would later prove useful to the scientists developing the atomic bomb, who studied the Halifax blast as one of the few available examples of a large-scale detonation in an urban environment. The harbour was rebuilt. The Richmond district was replanned and reconstructed. But the old neighbourhood, with its wooden houses and narrow streets and the particular texture of a working-class maritime community, was gone forever, replaced by the carefully planned grid of the new Hydrostone district, named for the fireproof building material used in its construction. The Mont Blanc herself left almost no physical trace. A few twisted fragments of metal, an anchor lodged in a hillside, and a crater on the harbour floor that slowly filled with silt. The explosion had been so complete that the ship simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only the wound it had made in a city and a lesson, written in fire and blast pressure, about the consequences of complacency in the presence of danger. If you were to ask the average person to name the deadliest shipwreck in history, most would answer the Titanic. Some might guess the Lusitania, or perhaps the Bismarck. Almost no one would name the Wilhelm Gustloff, and yet this converted cruise liner, torpedoed in the frozen Baltic Sea on the night of January 30th, 1945, killed more people in a single sinking than any other vessel in recorded history. An estimated 9,400 souls, more than 6 times the death toll of the Titanic. The reason it is not remembered is both simple and deeply uncomfortable. The dead were almost all Germans, and they died in the closing months of a war that Germany had started, fleeing an advancing Soviet army whose ferocity was itself a response to the atrocities committed by Germany on the Eastern Front. The story of the Wilhelm Gustloff does not fit neatly into the moral framework that the post-war world constructed around the Second World War, and so it was set aside, remembered in Germany with quiet grief and largely ignored everywhere else. The Wilhelm Gustloff had been built in the late 1930s as a cruise ship for the Kraft durch Freude program, Strength Through Joy, a Nazi leisure organization that offered subsidized vacations to German workers as part of the regime's effort to demonstrate the benefits of National Socialism to ordinary citizens. She was a handsome modern vessel named after the assassinated leader of the Nazi Party's Swiss branch, and before the war she had carried thousands of German workers on Mediterranean and Scandinavian cruises. When the war began, she was repurposed, first as a hospital ship, then as a barracks for the German submarine training division based in the Baltic port of Gortenhafen, now the Polish city of Gdynia. By January of 1945, with the Soviet army advancing rapidly across East Prussia, the Gustloff was pressed into service for one final mission, Operation Hannibal, the massive naval evacuation of German military personnel and civilians from the Baltic coast. The scene at Gortenhafen in late January was one of barely controlled panic. Hundreds of thousands of refugees, soldiers, wounded men, women, children, elderly, were converging on the Baltic ports, desperate to escape the approaching Red Army. The stories filtering back from the front were horrifying. Mass executions, systematic assaults on women, the destruction of entire villages. The fear was not abstract. It was visceral, immediate, and grounded in documented reality. The Wilhelm Gustloff was designed to carry approximately 1,500 passengers in peacetime. When she sailed from Gortenhafen on the afternoon of January 30th, she was carrying more than 10,000 people. The exact number will never be known, because in the chaos of the evacuation, passenger manifests were incomplete or abandoned entirely. Estimates range from just over 10,000 to as high as 10,600. The ship was grotesquely overcrowded. Every cabin, every corridor, every public room, every stairwell was packed with people, refugees huddled on the floor with their children, wounded soldiers on stretchers, naval personnel, women's auxiliary members, and the submarine trainees who had been stationed aboard. The Gustloff sailed into the Baltic in the company of a single escort vessel, a torpedo boat wholly inadequate to protect such a large and slow target in waters known to be patrolled by Soviet submarines. The weather was atrocious: heavy seas, bitter cold, and temperatures well below freezing. A debate among the ship's officers over whether to run with lights on or off ended in a fatal compromise. The navigation lights were turned on after a false report of an oncoming German minesweeper convoy. The lights made the Gustloff visible to the Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko, which had been stalking targets in the area for days. At approximately 9 in the evening, Marinesko fired 4 torpedoes. 3 struck the Gustloff on the port side. The ship began to list almost immediately. What followed was a catastrophe of almost incomprehensible scale. The ship's lifeboats were frozen in their davits and could not be lowered. The davit mechanisms had seized in the cold. The decks were coated in ice. Panic spread instantly through the packed corridors. Passengers trampled one another in the stairwells. Mothers handed their children to strangers in the hope that someone, anyone, might reach a lifeboat. Some passengers jumped into the Baltic, where the water temperature was near freezing, and died of hypothermia within minutes. Others were crushed in the internal stampedes. The ship sank in approximately 45 minutes, the bow going under first, while the stern rose into the air in a scene that survivors later compared to a skyscraper collapsing into the sea. Of the more than 10,000 people aboard, approximately 1,100 were rescued by the torpedo boat and other vessels that responded to distress signals. Everyone else, roughly 9,300 men, women, and children, perished, most of them in the water, many of them trapped inside the sinking hull. An estimated 5,000 of the dead were children. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff was not the only catastrophe of Operation Hannibal. 10 days later, the transport ship General von Steuben was torpedoed in the same waters, with the loss of approximately 4,500 lives. And in April, the transport Goya was sunk with an estimated 7,000 dead. Together, these 3 sinkings constitute the deadliest sequence of maritime disasters in history, all but unknown outside the specialized literature of naval history and the memories of the German families who lost everything in the frozen Baltic. The Gustloff has been the subject of a handful of books and a German television film, but it has never entered the broader cultural consciousness the way the Titanic has. Its story is too tangled in the moral complexities of the war, too difficult to narrate without confronting the reality that civilians, including thousands of children, can be victims even when they belong to the nation that authored the conflict. The wreck lies in shallow water off the Polish coast, officially designated as a war grave. Diving to it is restricted. The dead remain inside, undisturbed, in the cold and the dark, at the bottom of a sea that took more lives in the winter of 1945 than any ocean has taken in any comparable period of human history. We end our journey not with a disaster of human life, but with a shipwreck whose consequences are still unfolding. A vessel whose cargo was so valuable and whose legal status is so contested that it has generated diplomatic disputes, treasure hunting scandals, and courtroom battles that have lasted for more than 3 centuries. The San Jose was a Spanish galleon, a 64-gun warship and treasure ship of the Spanish crown, and when she sank on the 8th of June 1708 off the coast of Cartagena de Indias in what is now Colombia, she took with her a cargo that modern estimates value at somewhere between $4 and $17 billion, the single most valuable shipwreck ever discovered, a prize so immense that it has been called the Holy Grail of the deep. The San Jose was the flagship of the Tierra Firme fleet, the annual convoy that carried the wealth of Spain's South American colonies back across the Atlantic to fund the Spanish war effort in the War of the Spanish Succession, a continent-wide conflict that was redrawing the political map of Europe. The cargo aboard the San Jose that day was staggering. Gold bars, silver coins, emeralds from the mines of Muzo and Chivor in the Colombian highlands, and a vast quantity of other precious goods accumulated over several years of colonial production. The treasure had been delayed in Cartagena for an unusually long time because the war had made the Atlantic crossing too dangerous to attempt. By the time the convoy finally sailed in June of 1708, the treasure represented years of accumulated wealth, the taxes, tithes, and trade profits of an entire colonial economy compressed into the holds of a single fleet. The San Jose carried the largest share. The fleet had barely cleared the harbour of Cartagena when it was intercepted by a British squadron under Commodore Charles Wagga. The British had been waiting. Intelligence reports had told them the treasure fleet would sail, and Wagga had positioned his ships to ambush it near the Baru Peninsula, south of Cartagena. The engagement that followed was brief and decisive. The San Jose exchanged fire with Wagga's flagship for approximately 2 hours before something, likely a direct hit to her powder magazine, caused a catastrophic internal explosion. The galleon was torn apart and sank within minutes, taking her entire crew of approximately 600 men and virtually all of her cargo to the bottom. The other Spanish ships scattered, some escaped, some were captured, and one was deliberately run aground and burned by her own crew to prevent her treasure from falling into British hands. The loss of the San Jose was a significant blow to the Spanish war effort. The gold and silver in her holds had been earmarked for the Spanish treasury, which was desperate for funds to sustain its military campaigns across Europe. Without that infusion of colonial wealth, Spain's financial position weakened further, contributing to the string of military setbacks that would eventually lead to the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 and the beginning of Spain's long decline as a European great power. The wreck's location was approximately known for centuries, somewhere in the waters off Cartagena, in several hundred feet of water. But the technology to find and recover her did not exist until the modern era. In November of 2015, the Colombian Navy announced that the San Jose had been found resting on the seabed at approximately 600 meters depth, with her cannons, ceramics, and gold coins visible in photographs taken by underwater drones. The discovery set off an immediate and extraordinarily complex legal battle. Colombia claimed the wreck as a national cultural heritage asset, citing its location in Colombian territorial waters. Spain argued that the San Jose was a sovereign vessel of the Spanish crown, and that international law protects the wrecks of state ships regardless of where they lie. A group of American salvage companies, one of which claimed to have located the wreck years earlier under a previous contract with the Colombian government, demanded a share of any recovered treasure, and indigenous and Afro-Colombian advocacy groups pointed out that much of the gold and silver aboard had been extracted through the forced labor of enslaved and colonized peoples, and that any recovery should acknowledge and address that legacy. As of now, the San Jose remains on the ocean floor, largely untouched. Colombia has announced plans for a phased recovery operation, but the legal and diplomatic challenges are immense, and the technology required to excavate a wreck at 600 meters, carefully enough to satisfy archaeologists, transparently enough to satisfy courts, and diplomatically enough to avoid an international incident, does not yet exist in a fully proven form. The treasure sits in the dark, under enormous pressure, surrounded by the scattered remains of 600 sailors who died in a war that most people have forgotten, guarding a fortune that multiple nations claim but none can yet retrieve. The San Jose is, in a sense, the perfect shipwreck. A vessel whose story touches colonialism, warfare, international law, indigenous rights, and the enduring human obsession with treasure, all tangled together in a knot that 3 centuries have not been enough to untie. These are the ships the world forgot, or tried to forget. A prince's boat turned back toward a sinking ship, and centuries of English history pivoted on that single act of loyalty. A pharmacist with delusions of grandeur built a kingdom of terror on a coral island in the Indian Ocean. A porcelain cargo lay on the sea floor for nearly 2 centuries, waiting to tell the story of a migration that remade Southeast Asia. A steamboat full of men who had already survived the worst their country could do to them was destroyed by the very system that was supposed to bring them home. A Sunday outing erased a neighborhood from the map of New York. A liner sank in 14 minutes in a river and was buried between the Titanic and a world war. A floating ammunition depot vaporized a city block and shattered 10,000 windows. A cruise ship turned refugee ark carried more people to their deaths than any vessel before or since. And a galleon full of colonial gold still sits at the bottom of the Caribbean, waiting for the world to decide who has the right to raise her. Every one of these wrecks changed something: a dynasty, a city, a law, a border, a community. And every one of them reminds us that the ocean does not care about our plans. It does not read passenger manifests or cargo lists. It takes what it takes, and it keeps what it keeps, and the stories it holds are only ever told by the ones who were lucky enough or unlucky enough to survive. Sleep well tonight. The sea is patient, and these stories will be here when you wake. If somehow you're still awake and hearing my voice, I'd very much appreciate you subscribing. And until our next episode, thank you for listening.